Welcome to the Via Stoica podcast, where we discuss Stoicism, the ancient philosophy of living the good life. I'm your host, Bryce, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Benny and Brendan. We are here to help you apply Stoic wisdom to your everyday life, no matter what the obstacle you may be facing, whether it be work stress, relationship issues, or just the general ups and downs of life. Stoicism has something to offer us all.
So welcome to the Via Stoica podcast. Today we have a great guest today, a very big name in the Stoic world for those who know him, for those who don't. We have Massimo Pigliucci, a well-known author, speaker on Stoicism, pretty much everything Stoicism. You can follow him. He has written a great book, one of my all-time favorites, How to Be a Stoic, a wonderful conversation with Epictetus. It's ever since I've read it, it was amazing. And he has a new book out now, Beyond Stoicism. But maybe, Massimo, you want to talk about the people who might not know you. I think most of our audience, they might know you already. But maybe you want to give you a little bit of background of what you've been doing and how you started into Stoic philosophy and started writing about it and sharing your view and knowledge on the topic.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. How did I get started? Well, because I went through a midlife crisis, and I was looking for some kind of framework, some kind of way of handling stuff. This was a number of years ago, and up to that point, I considered myself a secular humanist. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, then now it's the time to see what kind of resources secular humanism has. And it turns out not many. Because it's a great set of ideas. It's all about, human rights and using reason and science and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I know. But when I'm hit by a divorce or my father dying, which was what was happening at the time, it's like that human rights doesn't help. And science not that much more better either. So I started, at the time I was studying philosophy because I was in transition in terms of academic career. My first academic career was as an evolutionary biologist. And I was moving toward philosophy of science. So I actually went back to graduate school and got my Ph.D. in philosophy. And therefore, of course, I was studying not just philosophy of science, I was studying also ethics, ancient philosophy, etc. So I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity. Let's see what philosophy. If philosophy doesn't have anything to offer in general, then I might need to rethink this whole thing. And so I studied kind of systematically. I studied with Buddhism because some of my friends said, if we're talking about a practical philosophy, you might want to look into Buddhism. And Buddhism does have a lot of interesting and useful things to say about how to deal with, midlife crisis and stuff like that. However, I couldn't get past the somewhat arcane language, even in modern translations of Buddhist material, and more importantly, the metaphysics, things like karma and reincarnation, all that's just like, no, that's not going to work for me. I'm a scientist in the 21st century. It's kind of hard for me to sort of wrap my head around that kind of stuff. So pretty quickly, I gravitated toward virtue ethics, the Greco-Roman approach. And from there, as usual, I started with Aristotle, and then I moved on to Epicurus. And both of them, again, were interesting. They were saying I was kind of feeling like I was getting closer, but it wasn't quite there. Aristotle is very theoretical. There's really not much in the way of practice that he talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics. Epicurus does get to practical things, and he does have a lot of good things to say about different aspects of life, particularly his emphasis on friendship, the importance of friendship, for instance, human relations, and things like that. However, the goal in life for an Epicurean is ataraxia, that is tranquility, serenity. And so he says, rightly, that if that's your goal, you should stay away from politics and social involvement, because otherwise, you're just asking for trouble. And although he's right, that's not going to work for me. I cannot imagine a meaningful life for me personally without sort of some kind of political and social involvement. So I was hanging around, said keep exploring. And then one day I saw on what at the time was still called Twitter, a thing that said, help us celebrate Stoic Week. And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? But then I sort of paused and I thought, wait, the Stoics. So that would be Marcus Aurelius And I read the meditations when I was in college and enjoyed it. And then I thought, oh, the Stoics, that's also Seneca. And I translated Seneca from Latin when I was in high school, back in Italy. And so I thought, well, I never thought that those two people were actually talking about the same kind of stuff. So let me take a look. And that's how it got started. And in terms of, writing about it, well, that's just me. Once I get into something and I find something that I think it's interesting and potentially useful, then I start writing and talking about it to other people. It's just the professor in me. It's a professional deformation, I suppose. And so it got started. And the first thing that I wrote about Stoicism was an article for the New York Times called "How to Be a Stoic," which later, of course, became the title of my first book. And it was a funny story because, so I actually written for the New York Times before. The New York Times at the time had a online blog, I guess, that was called The Stone, as in the Philosopher's Stone. And so this was about, philosophers, professional philosophers writing to the general public. And I had written for The Stone, but about my professional stuff. As a professional philosopher of science, I'm interested in the difference between science and pseudoscience. And so that's what I wrote about. So when I got into Stoicism, I wrote to Peter Catapano, who was the editor of The Stone at the Times. And I said, Peter, how about an article on Stoicism by a philosopher who is basically doing an experiment on himself and just trying out the philosophy? And Peter loved it. He said, oh, sure, write the thing and, we'll publish it. Okay, so they publish it. And then the following day, Peter calls me up and says, I'm really glad we published this thing because it is the most emailed article on the site. And I thought, oh, that's great. You mean the Stone site? And he said, no, the New York Times. I said, what? How the hell? What is it all these people are suddenly interested in Stoicism? Okay, so I hung up with Peter, and I was in my office at City College in New York, here in New York. And about an hour later, the phone rings again. You have to understand, this is very unusual. My phone never rings in my office, never, okay? I can't remember any other time that the phone actually rang. So I thought, that's weird. So I picked up, and it says, the voice on the other side says, hi, we are from Penguin. We've seen your article in the New York Times. Are you by any chance writing a book about this thing? And I thought, well, thank you for the interest, but no, that was just a one-off thing. And it's like, no, but thank you. All right. 2 more hours pass. Phone rings again. Hi, we're from Princeton Press. We read the article in the New York Times. Are you thinking of writing a book about it? It's like, well, I'm I don't know. I'll let you know. 1 more hour, third phone call. This time was an Italian publisher, Garzanti. And I thought, okay, yes, I am definitely writing a book about this thing. My agent will get in touch with you. I was surprised. I was stunned. I had no idea that there was that much interest in what I thought was a pretty obscure philosophy, back 2,000 plus years ago. But here we are. Stoicism really is, in fact, popular. And, a lot more books are out there now, a lot of more podcasts and blogs and all that sort of stuff. So it's surprising in mostly a positive way.
Yeah, that's a great story to hear, and I love most writers are looking for publishers, and here the publishers come looking for you.
I know, right? That's unusual.
Yeah, that's like a sign, right? Like I have to do something, and I really wanted to quick before Brendan can jump in. Like I really love the interaction you had with Epictetus and how to be a Stoic. For me, just that narrative alone was just refreshing and great to see. Like, okay, let me have a conversation with this person who died like 2,000 years ago. Yep. And I wonder where that came about. Like, how did you? And also because you mentioned Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, you've read them when you were living in Rome and translated Seneca. But where did that kind of it felt like you built a relationship with Epictetus. Where did that kind of come from? And why did you use him to create this wonderful narrative to write How to Be a Stoic?
Well, first of all, thanks for the compliment. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Right now, I'm in the process of writing the second edition of How to Be a Stoic, which will come out for the 10th anniversary in 2027. And so I'm revising and rereading the whole thing. And yeah, I am enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. The idea came out because actually from a phrase by Seneca. Seneca, in one of his letters, says we should have an ongoing conversation with the best minds of all times, and we can do that by just opening a book. So I thought, oh, that's an interesting thought. I love that. But with Epictetus specifically, because Epictetus is the one that really turned me onto Stoicism. As it turns out, just by chance, that year, Stoic Week started out with material from Epictetus. And so when I downloaded the first suggested readings and then exercises and stuff like that, I started reading this guy and I remember one of the early bits of the discourses where Epictetus says, recounts this story about a Roman senator who was condemned to death, potentially condemned to death. He was on trial for alleged treason against the emperor. I think it was Nero. So this guy is Epictetus tells us what happened, and this guy's having a conversation with his friends, and he says, "Well, we don't know what the Senate is going to decide. So right now it's time to go to the gym. Let's go to the gym." Like, okay. Then he comes back from the gym, and a messenger comes in and says, "Well, the Senate has reached a verdict." And the senator says, "Okay, death or exile?" "Exile." "Okay, do I get to keep my property or not?" "Yes, you do." "Okay, then let's go out to my villa outside of Rome and have lunch." And I thought, whoa, that's mind-blowing. That's a very interesting way of sort of dealing with, serious adversity. And I thought, okay, who wrote this thing? Epictetus. I never heard of Epictetus. How is this even possible? I have taken, history of philosophy when I was in high school in Italy. I took graduate courses on philosophy, including ancient philosophy, here in the United States, and I never heard of Epictetus. How the hell is that possible? And so I started digging into it, and it turned out that Epictetus actually, up until the 19th century, was a household name. One of my favorite examples is one of the founding fathers, John Adams, who became, I think, second or third president of the United States. At some point, he writes to his wife, Abigail, "So did you read that passage by Epictetus?" Like, wow. So these people were actually aware of this stuff. In fact, it turns out all of the founding fathers of the American Republic had copies of the Enchiridion in their libraries. George Washington brought it with him in battle to inspire his troops. And we never heard of it. Most people today in the 20th and 21st century never heard of this guy. And so I thought, there's something missing here. I need to try to do something about it. And that's why How to Be a Stoic is centered on the three disciplines of Epictetus. And it is, as you say, an ongoing imaginary, obviously, conversation. But it uses real quotes. I mean, the conversation actually uses real quotes from Epictetus, from the discourses, to which then I respond or I make inquiries and so on.
Oh, wow. That is such a cool story, Massimo. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. How to think How to Be a Stoic is definitely the book that I recommend the most to people. It had the most impact for me in my journey in Stoicism. Stoicism to me was something that I only used when I was really dealing with something difficult, really challenging, really trying to make a tough decision. It wasn't something that I used or leaned on every day until I read your book, and I read it as a way that Stoicism is supposed to be something that I carry with me daily, and kind of is this teacher, and it gave me a much gentler and softer relationship with Stoicism than I had before that. And I really appreciate you for writing that book, because it definitely changed the way I approach the philosophy. So I really appreciate it. So I just wanted to let you know that.
Thanks, Bernard. And in fact, that is what you mentioned is a typical attitude, right? So people reach for Stoicism only in times of crisis. During the COVID pandemic, there was a spike in the sales of Marcus Aurelius' meditations, understandably. And I got a large number of calls from people who wanted to have like Zoom conversations and sort of be taught the basics of Stoicism so that they could deal better with the ongoing pandemic. And I told these people, I said, look, yes, we can do that for sure. I'll be happy to help. However, I said, consider this. What you're asking is the equivalent of somebody is running after you with a knife, and you duck into a place where they teach martial arts, and you say, can I learn a few moves so that I can get rid of this guy? Like, yes, you can, but it's not ideal. This is the kind of stuff that needs to be started when, in fact, the waters are calm, when there is no storm. And as you were just saying, Brendan, you need to do it every day. This is an everyday thing. It is like going to the gym. You don't go to the gym only immediately before you go to the Olympics, because otherwise you're not going to go to the Olympics. And once you start going to the gym, you do it for the rest of your life if you want to keep your physical health. And the same with Stoicism, if you want to keep your mental health.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a great analogy. I'm definitely going to use that. So thank you for that as well. But one question I have is, so as you kind of saw that, throughout the pandemic, obviously there was a resurgence in Stoicism, and I feel like it's getting kind of another resurgence now. Even we are seeing a lot more people come to our website and listen to our podcasts and things like that. So what do you think is kind of driving that interest in this ancient philosophy?
Pretty much, I think what drove interest in the original Stoicism. I mean, think about it this way. So Stoicism, of course, was Hellenistic philosophy. The Hellenistic period goes more or less from the death of Alexander the Great, and therefore the collapse of the Macedonian Empire, to the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, beats Cleopatra and Mark Antony, therefore essentially establishing the Roman Empire. So it's a period of turmoil. It's a period of major upheavals, a lot of political and cultural change throughout the Mediterranean world. And so people naturally felt out of place, and they felt, discombobulated. They felt like, what the hell is going on here? And how do I make sense? And of course, most people cannot affect events at that scale, right? I mean, it's not like we can do a lot about that sort of stuff. The collapse of empires or battles, epic battles between political giants that are going to define the future. And so we need to cope in one way or another. I think that is a major reason why the Hellenistic period really saw an explosion of these philosophies. And of course, philosophy started earlier. It started with the pre-Socratic in the Western tradition in the 6th century BCE. And then, of course, it reached the apex, according at least to scholars, with the classical period, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. But it really exploded actually in terms of number of people interested and number of schools during the Hellenistic period. So you got, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Cyrenaics, the Epicureans, two schools of skeptics, and a bunch of others. And I think that is the major reason. And sure enough, although these things, of course, are difficult to prove without a serious historical and sociological analysis, but at about the same time, like a couple of centuries earlier, 100, 150 years maybe earlier, the very same thing had happened in India, social turmoil, political change, and all that. And sure enough, you get the origin of Buddhism. And at about the same time, the same thing happened in China. And sure enough, you have the origin of Confucianism. So there was a whole period, sometimes referred to informally as the axial age, of about 200 or 300 years, where social change and political turmoil triggered these major changes in outlook, not only in the Western world, or what became later the Western world, but also in places like China and India. And we're looking now at a very similar thing, right? I mean, Stoicism started to become popular again in the late part of the 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, first couple of decades of the 21st century. What do we have? Well, the 20th century was saw 2 world wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union, realignment of, major realignment at a political level. The 21st century started out with 9/11, and and a couple of wars started by the United States in the aftermath. Those are major things, and it keeps going. I mean, we're seeing, you just mentioned a spike, a current ongoing spike of interest in Stoicism. Well, we just had a major presidential election in the United States. And the consequences are going to be interesting, to say the least, over the next 2 to 4 years. And so I can easily see how people, again, looking at this thing and what's happening and say, what the hell? How am I supposed to react to this? And that's when you reach either for religions, right, or for philosophies. And since major mainstream religions have kind of declined over the last several decades, then it doesn't surprise me that some of the alternatives, including, but not only Stoicism, become the target and become of interest to people.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense, and it does reflect, something when we spoke about Donald Robertson about where he had a similar answer with kind of the, lack, people not feeling as strongly about institutions like religions that they used to in the past. So that makes a lot of sense. One thing I wanted to kind of follow up on that is, so if we think that, there's this resurgence in Stoicism, and that's exciting for us, I would imagine, right? We all kind of support the idea of Stoicism and its teachings. But I do often see a lot of misconceptions in what Stoicism is. For example, like promoting the emotional suppression, that sort of thing. Yeah. So how do you address these misconceptions when you're introducing Stoicism to people?
Yeah. So I am concerned about that, and I write and talk about it. I think there are a number of misconceptions and a number of trends that I think are problematic surrounding Stoicism. But let's talk about first about the basic misconceptions. Yeah, the two big ones are that Stoicism is about sporting a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions. So basically, Mr. Spock from Star Trek, right? And as much as I love Spock as a character, no, that's not what Stoicism is about. Now, you can see where those misconceptions come from. The stiff upper lip thing is related to the notion that in Stoicism, endurance is in fact a virtue. If something happens and there is nothing you can do about it, then what's the point of throwing a tantrum? You just accept it and try to move on as much as you can, as best as you can, right? So the notion of the Stoics is that we are adults, we're not children. So if things don't go our way, if there is some kind of setback or even tragedy, well, you deal with it. You accept it, you try to overcome it, you try to get past it in a way that is mature and posed, and not by throwing a tantrum. So that can easily be misunderstood for a stiff upper lip, but it's not. It's really I think a mature way of dealing with issues. The suppression of emotion, there is a grain of truth there, right? So Stoicism, as you know, has a fairly developed theory of, psychological theory of emotions. For the Stoics, emotions have a cognitive component, which turns out to be the case, in fact, even according to modern science. That's why modern cognitive behavioral therapy got started in the 1960s on the direct inspiration of Stoicism. So for the Stoics, you can talk to your emotions, and you should, in fact, talk to your emotions, because you should try to modulate your emotions. And the Stoics divide emotions broadly into these two categories: healthy and unhealthy. Healthy emotions need to be cultivated mindfully. So these are things like, love for your children, or love for your partner, or even love for truth, or love for the notion of humanity, cosmopolitan, philanthropia, which of course is where the modern word philanthropy comes from. But originally, philanthropia didn't mean giving money to people if you're rich. It meant developing this attitude of loving humanity as a whole, right? Stoic cosmopolitanism. So those are healthy emotions. Why are they healthy? Because they're aligned with reason. So you have these image where emotions and reason go side by side, and those are healthy emotions because they go along in the same direction in which reason tells us we should go. But some emotions are opposed to reason. They try to overcome reason. And those are the problematic ones. Those are the unhealthy ones. The big one, as far as the Stoics are concerned, is anger. Right? Anger is not a positive thing, according to the Stoics. It gets in the way of good decision making. It leads you often to do things that you're going to regret later. If you're in a rage about something, even if that rage or anger is justified because maybe you're reacting to an injustice or something like that. Even so, if you allow your rage to build or your anger to build, you're probably going to do the wrong thing, right? The classic example for the Stoics is the story of Medea, who was in fact betrayed by her husband Jason, and treated very unfairly. But what does she do? She comes up with a revenge plan, which includes killing her own children. So just to spite Jason. Clearly, that's the kind of thing that anger leads you to do, and clearly not a good thing. Clearly something that one needs to work on. So you can see how these misconceptions, not about suppressing emotions, it's about talking to your emotions. It's about modulating your emotions so that you shift as much as possible away from the unhealthy ones and to cultivating the healthy ones. But that requires a few minutes of explanation, and if all you know about Stoicism is like, oh yeah, stiff upper lip, then you're gonna just go and run with it, and not actually listen to what the philosophy is really about.
Yeah, I like that. I wanted to ask a quick question about that as well, because I thought about the resurgence of Stoicism and whether it's the real, like the true version of Stoicism that's making a resurgence, or as a thing that we talking about. And it was actually Brendan who reminded us that you coined the frame broicism, right, in 2019. And I'd like to to hear a bit more about that, and especially about when you say like the anger. For me, when I think about the outward appearance of someone who's actually practicing Stoicism might look the same as someone who's applying the stiff upper lip, right?
Right.
Outwardly, it might seem the same, but the intentions and the work that you do inside and behind it, that is what truly matters. And that's where that's what I feel is lacking with all of these messages that you see out there from someone like Andrew Tate or maybe Jordan Peterson, right, or people like that. They miss that real work. So how did you come up with that term of broicism, and what made you kind of coin that phrase, or how did you start with that?
Well, I realized at some point that there are actually, in my mind, three fairly major deviations from actual Stoicism, which are problematic in different ways. One of them is the one that I call broicism, as in bro, right? So this is the manly man variety, red pill variety of Stoicism. These are people who, for instance, make these really somewhat strange arguments, such as, oh, the term virtue, which of course plays a major role in Stoicism, comes from the Latin vir. Vir means man, so here it is, manly man. Like, yeah, but the Latin vir is then in turn the translation of the Greek arete, and arete not only is gender neutral, it actually applies to objects, right? Arete means excellence. And so if you go out and buy a very good and excellent, very functional bread knife, that is a knife that actually cuts bread rather than your fingers, well, that bread knife is arete. It's it's an excellent bread knife. So the whole argument becomes really silly about if you go to the book. If you want to go etymologically, then you have to go really to the source, which is the Greek one, not the Roman one, right? And generally speaking, these people, the Broics, are people who tend to forget that there is a number of ideas in Stoicism that they don't like, and that's probably why they tend to forget them. So their emphasis, for instance, is on one of the four cardinal virtues, courage. Again, manly man goes into battle, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but courage is one of the four cardinal virtues. The other three are justice, wisdom, and temperance. And the Stoics saw those four as four aspects of the same underlying thing, which one might call wisdom more broadly construed. So, for instance, there is no such a thing as being courageous but unjust, right? The classic question is, can you have a courageous Nazi officer or Nazi soldier? And the answer, as far as the Stoics is concerned, is clearly no. You can have a Nazi officer or soldier who risks their life to defend the Führer, true, but that's not courage because it's unjust. A courageous Nazi soldier should have to turn around and shoot Hitler, not defend him, right? That's courage, according to the Stoics. So these people, the Stoics, are very selective in their understanding of Stoicism. They don't seem to remember, for instance, that the Stoics explicitly say, both Epictetus and Seneca, as well as Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus's teacher, they explicitly say that women have the same intellectual abilities that men, and therefore they ought to be taught philosophy and practice philosophy. So much for the manly man kind of thing, right? They also forget that Stoicism is a cosmopolitan philosophy, right? So it's about loving anybody and being helpful to anybody who is a rational being. So everyone on earth, every human being on earth falls under that category. So that's one problem with sort of distortion, what I would call distortions of Stoicism. The other two, I also give it different names, but they don't sound different from Stoicism, so you have to actually see it written. One is Stoicism spelled with a $sign instead of a S, right? So that's the Stoicism that you hear often on YouTube by YouTube influencers. Oh, embrace Stoicism, that way you become rich and famous, right? Or you win the Super Bowl or whatever. Dude, that's got nothing to do with Stoicism. Stoicism directly teaches you that externals are not important. So things like fame, wealth, glory, and all that sort of stuff, they're not important. They're preferred. They may be preferred under certain circumstances. And I want to open a parenthesis there about this business of preferred and dispreferred stuff, because a lot of people have misconceptions about it. So they may make your life better, in which case, sure, why not? But they are not the goal. The only goal is to be a good person, is to be specifically, that means to act rationally and pro-socially. That's the Stoics are very clear. Living according to nature, as they put it, meaning living according to human nature, it means living rationally and pro-socially. Why? Because human beings have rationality as their main weapon. We don't have big muscles, we don't fly, we don't swim fast, nothing. We just have big brains. And we're social animals. So that's why this is not an arbitrary choice by the Stoics. They look at human nature and say, well, what characterizes human beings? Big brains and very highly complex societies. So that is why they think that living a good human life means to do those two things, to use your brain and to live pro-socially. So the Stoicism with the $sign, it completely misses the point. And then finally, we have something that I spell Stoicism with a little s, but a capital M at the end. And that is the connection that some people have been making between Stoicism and militarism. All right, so again, this is kind of a variety of the Broic stuff, but specifically about the military. Now, there is no reason why people who are in the military shouldn't be behaving virtuously. And, hopefully that's what they try to do. Just recently, a few weeks ago, I gave a lecture, for instance, at West Point Academy, which is the premier military academy in the United States. And the cadets were very interested in Stoicism, the philosophy, in trying to live their life and practicing and acting as soldiers according to the 4 cardinal virtues, etc., etc. However, when we start hearing things like, use Stoicism in order to overcome PTSD, or use Stoicism in order to be tougher and all that sort of stuff, like, okay, well, now you're getting to, first of all, you're mixing up the philosophy and the techniques. They're not the same thing, right? The techniques are useful, but they're not the philosophy. The philosophy is a different thing. It's like saying, I meditate, therefore I'm a Buddhist. No, you're not. You are a Buddhist. Plenty of Buddhists don't meditate, first of all. And just because you meditate, it doesn't make you a Buddhist. You're a Buddhist if you accept the 4 noble truths and you could try to pursue the Eightfold Path to enlightenment. That's what makes you Buddhist, whether you meditate or not. What makes a Stoic is if you try to live according to nature, meaning again, rationally and pro-socially. Whether or not you have a philosophical diary, you take cold showers, or whatever the hell people think that Stoicism is all about, right? Plenty of people take cold showers and they're not Stoics, meaning that they don't act like Stoics in society. So we need to be careful. I mean, there is an inherent tension there between, if not the military, certainly militarism and Stoicism. As I said, Stoicism is a cosmopolitan philosophy. It teaches you to love every other human being. There's a tension between loving and killing those human beings, right? So now some of the Stoics and some of the people that in the ancient world that were very familiar and sort of positive about Stoicism, like Cicero, are responsible for the invention of what we today call the theory of just war. So the Stoics were not pacifists. I don't want to be misunderstood in that perspective. Plenty of Stoics in history took up arms when they thought that this was needed. Cato the Younger opposed Julius Caesar on the Senate floor for many years, and then when Caesar declared war on the Republic, Cato picked up arms and fought, right? And he's not the only example. We started out this conversation with the example of a senator mentioned by Epictetus who opposed what he saw as the tyranny of the Emperor Nero. And there were others, the so-called Stoic opposition to 3 emperors, in fact, Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian. So there's nothing inherently pacifist about Stoicism. But for the Stoics, the use of violence is the very last resort. And so people like Cicero actually came up with what later then got picked up by the Christians, particularly by Thomas Aquinas, and then today is still known as the theory of just war, which means, yeah, sure, if need be, you pick up your weapons and defend yourself, but it has to be defensive, not offensive. It has to be the last resort after everything else has failed. The response has to be proportional. You have to try at all costs to avoid collateral damage and civilian casualties. You have to stop immediately as soon as you reach the objective, etc., etc. If you look at it from that perspective, almost no war in the history of humanity fits those requirements. The most likely exception is World War II. Yes, Hitler did need to be opposed, period. Even I've been reading recently a biography of Einstein. I'm actually about to write an essay arguing Einstein was essentially a Stoic. Because he never used the word, and he may not even have been aware of the philosophy, although he was definitely a follower of Spinoza, who is in fact considered essentially a modern Stoic. But Einstein wrote this interesting short essay in 1930, What I Believe. And if you go through it, it's all Stoic creeds. He's a cosmopolitan, he's a pacifist as much as it is possible, except for the last resort, etc., etc. So it's very interesting. But even Einstein, who started out as a complete pacifist, as 100% pacifist, when he saw Hitler come into power in 1933 in Germany, he said, well, no, we cannot afford to be pacifists. This guy needs to be fought against. So there's certainly a notion of defense in support of justice in the Stoics, but militarism it's a whole different. Nationalism is also not compatible with Stoicism because Stoicism is cosmopolitan, right? So as far as the Stoics are concerned, the national boundary is just an accident of geography and history. They're not a thing. Now that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, then therefore, as Stoics, we should start advocating open borders, throughout the world. Not immediately, but the goal should be that one. Long term, it should be a family of humanity, not these little parochial things which are the major reason for strife, for unnecessary strife and violence. So if you indulge me, where I wanted to make a comment about the preferred and this preferred indifference, because even some Stoic practitioners I noticed are a little bit confused about that. So the typical story you hear in modern Stoic circles is that the chief good or the only true good is virtue, or in other words, working on your character, improving as a person, etc. But that other things such as wealth, health, and even reputation and stuff like that are preferred indifference, right? So meaning that other things being equal, so long as they don't conflict with your practice of virtue, it's fine to have them or to pursue them. That's not quite right. What makes an indifferent preferred is if it helps your practice of virtue. And only under those conditions, that thing is preferred. So for instance, is it okay to pursue wealth? It depends on what you do with that wealth. If you're using your wealth to help other people, then yes, it becomes a preferred indifferent. But if you use that wealth just to enrich yourself and have a comfortable life, no, it's not. It is not a preferred indifferent. In fact, it may get in the way of your practice of virtue because it exposes you to temptations. Same goes for saying something like, reputation or fame. Is fame a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's not a good because it's not virtue, right? Not a bad because it's not a vice. But is it preferred? It's preferred if you're using, again, your fame or your reputation in order to be helpful to the human cosmopolis. But if you use it just so that you can rack more, views on YouTube or likes on Facebook and make money out of it, no, it's not preferred. It's at best neutral, and at worst, it can actually get in the way of working on your own character, in which case it becomes dispreferred. So one needs to be careful. The Stoicism, it's a pretty demanding philosophy.
That's a question I had for you, Massimo, too, is, where we are with Stoicism. And I think you're considered kind of a leader of the Neo-Stoic movement, right? And the thing with Stoicism is it was really popular, for that certain period of time, and then it falls off with all the other kind of pagan traditions, right? Once Rome kind of accepts Christianity, right? That becomes the philosophy of the ages for a while. But there's this kind of weird, it pops back up in the Middle Ages and dies down, and then it has kind of a resurgence here in the 20th century. What do you think about the wiggle room, right? Because you made a good point there about the traditional Stoics, and we have we're in some of these same conversations and groups and in the background, and there's like the hard line. No, this is Stoicism. This is the way it is. You can't call yourself a Stoic unless you do these things. And then there's today's version where, like, I found Stoicism years ago through Tim Ferriss, who was connected to Ryan Holiday, right? And it's more of a popular movement. It seems more flexible. And I like how you said Stoic techniques versus Stoicism. Do you think people can really call themselves Stoic if they just use Stoic technique? Because Stoic techniques show up everywhere, right? How many people have I talked to who goes, well, I was a Stoic my whole life and I didn't know it. And it's like, well, from a purist point of view, you're probably not. But you have these patterns in these ways that are very effective, right? We're using reason and logic, and very simplistic, right? Their framework of engaging life. So what do you think about like the modern Stoic? Is it just, hey, I'm a guy who uses Stoic techniques, and I always say that we're a scavenger of wisdom. We'll get to your new book, which is really good about trying to figure out who we are. But what do you think about the new movement? What flexibility do we have with Stoicism today?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And of course, the answer is a little bit complicated. So purism, I think it's a silly thing. With all due respect to the so-called self-professed traditional Stoics, there's no such a thing as a traditional Stoic. Stoicism is a philosophy that started out 2,300 years ago, and things have changed. The Stoics themselves, the ancient Stoics themselves, very clearly disagreed among themselves on a number of points. Very clearly stated, Seneca, for instance, that, those who preceded us are just our teachers, not our masters. If we discover new things or better ways of doing things, then it behooves us to follow those new paths. That's in ancient Stoicism. So to say that unless you're doing this or that, you're not a Stoic, I think it's rather silly. That said, using techniques, as I was saying before, does not make you a Stoic. Just in the same way in which meditating doesn't make you a Buddhist. Those techniques work. There's no question about it. There is pretty good empirical evidence, as I said, from cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, that a lot of so-called Stoic techniques do work. And if people want to use them, look, if meditating makes you feel better, or if keeping a journal of your thoughts makes you feel better or it helps to improve your life, why the hell not? But you don't need to call yourself a Buddhist or a Stoic if you just do that. What you need to do, the way you really are a Buddhist or a Stoic, as I said, is if you embrace the principles of the philosophy. Now, there we can have a reasonable disagreement about, well, which principles, right? So the so-called traditional Stoics, modern traditional Stoics, will tell you that unless you accept Stoic pantheism and the Stoic view of the world as a living organism endowed with reason, then you're not a Stoic. Whatever, then I'm not a Stoic, I suppose. But I think that's a little silly. Some of the Stoics themselves disagree. Again, the ancient Stoics themselves rejected. Posidonius, for instance, rejected the notion of a living organism as the universe as a living organism. So, what? Posidonius was not a Stoic? I think he was. Cicero certainly tells us that he was a Stoic, and he considered himself a Stoic. So, what the heck? But that is, in fact, a discussion to be had. Is it reasonable today to believe that the world is a living organism endowed with reason? Some people think yes. I think not. I'm a biologist. I know what an organism looks like. And the universe doesn't strike me as a living organism at all. Not even close. It doesn't have it doesn't have metabolism. It doesn't reproduce. It doesn't evolve. It doesn't have any of the characteristics that we associate with living organisms. So why go there? Modern science seems to reject that notion. And the Dalai Lama himself, if we want to switch back to Buddhism, when he was asked, what if there's going to be some conflict between science and Buddhism, his response was, well, then Buddhism will have to change and adapt, right? You don't reject the modern view of science just because you want to cling on something that was proposed, 2,000 years ago in a clearly pre-scientific era. But we can have discussions about what exactly makes you or doesn't make you Stoic. In my opinion, for instance, if you reject the notion of living according to nature, about which, as I said, the Stoics were very clear. This is an early notion. This is not just Epictetus and the late Stoics. That phrase appears in Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoic philosophy, right? And it is repeated ever since. Everyone uses it. Chrysippus uses it. The third head of the Stoa, the Middle Stoics use it, and the late Stoics. So this is a universal feature of Stoicism, okay? And it's clear what they mean. As I said before, they mean act reasonably, rationally, and pro-socially. So if you reject that, then what's the point of calling yourself a Stoic? I mean, then you're doing something else, right? The answer to your question is there is a distinction between techniques and philosophy. And just because you practice the techniques, that doesn't mean you're practicing the philosophy. That said, we can have a reasonable discussion about what counts as the philosophy.
No, that's great. That's a great answer. Appreciate that, Massimo. And I guess my theory on it now is I'm getting tired of labels, and especially I want to talk about your new book, right? Beyond Stoicism, because I've called myself a Stoic for a while now, but what I really found out probably in the last year, is that I'm probably 60% Stoic. I'm more Epicurean than I thought I ever was before after reading through your new book. And I find myself being Aristotelian on some things. So maybe the labels aren't really that helpful. It's really more about finding techniques. I think that's what we're interested here with Via Stoica is, how do we find that eudaimonia? How do we live a better life? I think it's a combination of all that. So let's talk about your new book. Of course, your old books, you have many to refer to. How to Be a Stoic is one of your most famous ones. I want to dig into some of your science stuff here. What is it? Philosophy of Pseudoscience. I like that one. There's a couple titles here. And Nonsense on Stilts. Those are some interesting points or background that you have, right? Because you have this science background. But but going forward then into this new book, though, right? It's really, I think, helpful. Me as a practicing Stoic, it helped me kind of reevaluate what I believe, and then I measure up. I passed the test. You have your little workbook at the end of each chapter when you discuss this Western tradition of if you're an Epicurean, you think you're an Epicurean, this is kind of what they believe. How would you answer these questions? If you're a Stoic, if you're a Sophist, if whatever, you're Aristotelian, you're Neoplatonist, whatever it is, it kind of makes you really think about, hey, what do I believe, right? Was that what you're trying to do? Is this really, it's kind of a foundational book of, hey, what do I believe? Who am I? And how do I fit in the spectrum, if at all? Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I mean, what we were trying to do with that book was essentially to do, in a sense, what, again, Seneca himself clearly does, especially at the beginning of his letters to Lucilius. If you notice, many of the early letters end with what he calls a gift to Lucilius, and that gift is usually a quotation, and that quotation is usually from Epicurus. And at some point, Lucilius must have written back and say, "What the hell are you doing? Epicurus is not a Stoic. You know that, right?" And so Seneca explains. He says, "Look, I don't go into another camp as a traitor, but as a scout. And if I discover something that appears to be true and useful, I'll use it." He says, "The truth, nobody controls the truth. The truth is everybody's is at everybody's disposal." So, in a sense, to some extent, that was the point of that book. That Beyond Stoicism covers a number of classical and Hellenistic philosophies, because what to us is important is the virtue ethics tradition in general, broader than just Stoicism. Yes, Stoicism is a very important and very powerful example of the virtue ethics tradition, but it's not the only one, and it's not isolated. Stoicism itself started out as an eclectic philosophy, right? So Zeno of Citium, before he started teaching what later became Stoicism at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch in Athens, right? He spent years first studying with Crates of Thebes, who was a Cynic, and then with Stilpo, who was a Megarian, and then at the Platonic Academy. So he picked up, and you can see this because Stoicism includes ideas that come from a bunch of other philosophies, right? So the notion that virtue is the only good, that comes from cynicism. The notion that there are four cardinal virtues, that's Plato in the Republic, right? And so on. The idea that logic is important for a life, understanding logic, meaning good reasoning, it's important in order to live a good life. That comes from the Megarians. So Stoicism itself started out as eclectic philosophy. Now, arguably a little too eclectic, which is why the third head of the Stoa, Chrysippus, who was a logician, came in and kind of basically cleaned the house. He rejected some notions, he streamlined others, he kind of melded Stoicism into a more coherent philosophy, so much so that the commentator Diogenes Laertius tells us that if not for Chrysippus, there wouldn't be a Stoa, right? And that's what he means by that. So, and that story, I think, brings to the forth this tension between eclecticism and a specific philosophy, right? You don't want to go, we don't advocate necessarily in the book that people just pick and choose as like a la carte, oh, that sounds good to me. And so put it here, that sounds like, that probably tastes good, so let me put it in there. Because if you do that, what you're going to end up very likely is an incoherent mess. Okay, some of these ideas are not compatible with each other, or at least the compatibility is something that needs to be worked out pretty carefully. I mean, there is a reason why we go back to established philosophies of life, such as Stoicism or Epicureanism or Aristotelianism, because they're well thought out. Why would you want to reinvent the wheel if people had done that work for you thousands of years ago, right? But at the same time, philosophies of life are not religions. And therefore, you don't want to be rigid about it. I still consider myself a Stoic, but I consider myself a skeptical Stoic, meaning that I introduce elements into Stoicism that come from especially the academic version of skepticism. The one that was developed by Carneades and by Cicero, for instance. Why? Well, because I think that improves the basic Stoic ideas. So in the book, what we do is, I think, a very clear map of the territory, right? We use these metaphor of navigating to three different ports. We call it the port of pleasure, the port of character, and the port of doubt. Because in our mind, all of the Hellenistic philosophies can be understood using one of these three keys. Either they were hedonistic philosophies, they emphasize pleasure. That's, of course, Epicureanism, but also Cyrenaicism, which actually preceded Epicureanism. Or they emphasized virtue, character. So those are Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Cynicism, and that sort of stuff. Or they emphasized doubt, the fact that we really shouldn't be too sure of anything. And those are the academic skeptics, the Pyrrhonists, who was the other major school of skepticism, but even the sophists, at least some of the sophists, like Pythagoras, and even Socrates. Socrates himself, who is actually the originator of basically of all of these schools of thought, because all of the Hellenistic schools either consider themselves descendants of Socrates, or like the Stoics, the Cyrenaics, the Stoics, the Cynics, etc., or they set themselves in opposition to Socrates, like the Epicureans, right? But either way, Socrates is the point of reference. But Socrates himself was a skeptic, in a sense, because if you look at the Platonic dialogues, what happens there? Socrates doesn't lecture you. He doesn't start out and saying, blah, 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 you should believe this or that or that or the other. He starts by asking questions. So, okay, Nicias, you're a general. Surely you know what courage is. Why don't you tell me? And then the poor Nicias starts articulating, a notion of courage. And Socrates says, yeah, but what about these other things, right? And then they keep going like this. And the dialogues, most of the dialogues end in aporia, which is a Greek word for confusion, right? Meaning that you don't know what the answer is. You certainly don't get a sense that Socrates had a particular answer in mind. Maybe he did, but that's not his style. What he does is he keeps asking questions to people to force them to think more carefully and more critically about what they perhaps assumed that they knew, but it turns out they don't necessarily know. That's a fundamentally skeptical attitude. Now, the question in my mind is, can you combine elements of the three ports into a coherent philosophy? And I think you can. And Stoicism is actually, a modern Stoicism is actually probably a good model for that, although certainly not the only one. So modern research in psychology shows some interesting things that are pertinent to this discussion. It shows, first of all, that a life without meaning is really bad for human beings. And a meaningful life, typically, a life with meaningful projects, typically involves other people. That is, we naturally find things meaningful if they involve other people or benefit other people, right? That's the part of character. Okay? The eudaimonic approach is what it's called even today by modern psychologists, the eudaimonic approach to life. That is a life that is based on meaningful pro-social activities. However, modern psychologists also show that life is certainly enhanced by a peppering of hedonism, pleasure, right? If you just do only work and no pleasure, you're going to have a tough life. It's still a meaningful life, but it's a tough one. So hedonism as a spice to be peppered, sprinkled on your main dish of eudaimonia, it's a very good idea. Not necessarily the other way around. There's actually at this point empirical evidence that if people try to live a mostly hedonic life with no eudaimonic component, they're not satisfied. They're not very happy at the end of the day. Modern psychology also shows that to be too sure of your own opinions is not good. It carries all sorts of antisocial behaviors. It carries all sorts of neuroses and stuff like that, which means that a pinch of skepticism is also a good thing, right? Or a basic attitude of skepticism. So I have come to the conclusion, in part by doing the research for the book, for Beyond Stoicism, that a good life is one of these mostly eudaimonic, so mostly about being rational and pro-social, striving to be rational and pro-social, with a spicing of pleasure and with an underlying attitude of skepticism, meaning that you're never completely sure that you're right on anything. You're always open to the possibility that you could be wrong, and therefore you're going to change your mind about it. And I hope that that's helpful. I mean, what we do in the book is, as you say, we help people explore these philosophies and test themselves and maybe live those philosophies for a few days, aspects, at least some aspects of those philosophies. And then by the end of the book, you have a much better idea of what it means to approach the world from the point of view of virtue ethics.
Yeah, I love that because, here at the Stoica, we help people, and we always say, like, we're not here to turn people into Stoics, but we really would like to encourage people to find their own philosophy of life. And I think that if people lived a little bit more philosophical, then the world will look very different, right? And I think that your book is a great tool for that. I myself used the book called Introduction into Existentialism by Olson, where a lot of different philosophies were compared. And what I like with your book is that you offer those tools to practically apply them for a couple of days, right? To see, okay, let me just try this out. Let me experiment. And I wanted to know, like, what do you think, like, would make you mentioned some of the key components, but what would really help people to find that philosophy of life? Is that also what you kind of intended to do with the book and with these exercises, to help people find their philosophy of life? And what would that entail to you if you would address some of the listeners? Like, how would that look like, a philosophy of life, the creation of it?
So if people go through the book, they'll see that at the end of each chapter, not only there are the exercises, but you're asked to sort of make a note of what worked and what didn't work. And then at the end of the book, you kind of come up with a summary. There is a section at the end of the book where you can say, okay, let me go over now all of my notes and see and tally them up, basically, and see what happened. That's supposed to aid you in the right direction, to orient you in the right direction, right? So we don't claim that any particular philosophy of life is good for everybody or works for everybody. We don't claim that there is one that is superior or better than all the other ones. What we do claim, as you were saying a minute ago, Benny, that everybody has a philosophy of life, whether they realize it or not. And by philosophy of life, I mean everybody acts in certain ways in the world in accordance with certain principles, whether they are aware of those principles or not, whether they inherited those principles from a religious upbringing, for instance, or just from societal mores or anything like that. Well, then if there really is no option but to live a philosophy of life, you might as well think about it and being aware of it, right? Because there may be things in your life that are not working, and that is because you embraced perhaps a philosophy that it's actually not working for you, or it's not working in general. Maybe there are issues with that philosophy that you want to be aware of. So ultimately, this is an invitation to people to be a little bit more reflective. Socrates famously says the unexamined life is not worth living, right? Now, that may be too much. I think that I've known people who do not examine their lives, and yet they've had lives that are certainly worth living. My grandparents, for instance, they were not exactly the reflective kind of people, and yet they were both, exquisite individuals, very good human beings, and I think their lives was definitely worth living. But it could have been better had they been more cognizant of what they were doing and why they were doing it. Maybe they could have avoided some mistakes, or they could have, focused their efforts and their resources better in that way. So that's all we're claiming, that there are resources out there. And of course, the Greco-Roman tradition is only one tradition, right? You could write a book just like Beyond Stoicism, focusing on the Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, all of those. There's lots of similar philosophies of life, some of which have been described as similar to the notion of virtue ethics. I mean, people have scholars in those. I'm not an expert in those philosophies, but I've read articles from scholars in Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, claiming that those philosophies have at least certain aspects of virtue ethics. So yeah, you could write a whole other book, focusing on those traditions, not to mention, of course, traditions from Mesoamerica or from Africa and so on and so forth. But of course, the three of us, meaning my friend Greg Lopez, Mary Quince, and myself, we are familiar with the Greco-Roman tradition, so we don't pretend to go too far afield. This is already a lot of work. I mean, trust me, some of these of the readings and the research you have to do to master at a decent level those 13 philosophies that we write in the book about in the book. It's already a lot of work. So we didn't feel like it was reasonable to expect any more.
Oh, okay. No, that's really great, Massimo. Thank you for that overview and an understanding. And it's really great. That seems to be this idea of this philosophy of life definitely seems to be kind of a theme throughout your books of cultivating and having that philosophy of life. And I completely agree. But I wanted to ask you, you have someone who's maybe listening to this podcast right now or started to become aware of Stoicism and that, it has helped others throughout their lives and through their challenges. But where can they start? Where is kind of the practical, thing that someone can start doing tomorrow to maybe be just that little bit more Stoic?
Yeah, that's a good question. In my mind, an excellent starting point is Epictetus's fundamental rule, which often in modern parlance is referred to as the dichotomy of control. I find the word control to be problematic because it lends itself to misunderstanding, so I try not to use it. Epictetus himself doesn't use that term. He refers to it as the fundamental rule. And the fact that he calls it fundamental tells you right there that he thinks it's important, right? And one reason to look at the fundamental rule, to start with the fundamental rule, is because it's actually found in a number of other traditions. It's found in Judaism, it is found in Buddhism, and it's found even in modern Christianity. Maybe some of your viewers and listeners have heard of the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer, which was written by an American theologian in the 1930s, it's used mostly at the beginning of meetings of 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And the Serenity Prayer basically asks God to give you the wisdom to tell the difference between what you can change and what you cannot change, the courage to change what you can, and the serenity to accept what you cannot. Well, that's essentially Epictetus' fundamental rule, and it's not by chance because the Christians took it from the Stoic tradition. In the Enchiridion by Epictetus begins with the fundamental rule. He says, section 1.1 of the Enchiridion says, some things are up to us, other things are not up to us. And then he goes on and explains which things fall into each category and what you're supposed to do about it. The Enchiridion was used as a training manual, spiritual exercise manual by Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages. So this is it's not by chance that the same idea pops up in modern Christianity. So how do you start? Start by practicing and trying to internalize the fundamental rule. Now, let's be clear about what the rule says, right? It says it divides things in up to us and not up to us. And then Epictetus says the things that are up to us are our judgments, our decisions to act or not to act, right? And our values, our endorsed values. Now, you can simplify that further and basically collapse it into our judgments, because our decisions to act or not to act are value judgments, and our decisions to endorse or not a particular value, it's a judgment. So really, he's saying that the only thing that is up to us is our judgments. What is not up to us are the outcomes of our actions, right? Once you internalize that, it literally applies to everything you do. Like, for instance, right before we started this conversation, as you know, we ran into technical issues first because of my iPad that wasn't connecting correctly, my camera wasn't turning on, and then on your side because the connection wasn't that good, et cetera, et cetera. So we started, 20 minutes after we were supposed to. Now, analyze the situation from the point of view of Epictetus' fundamental rule. What here is up to me? What's up to me is to try to figure out what's wrong with the iPad, and try to figure out possible ways to solve that technical problem, right? What is not up to me is whether I succeed or not. Now, fortunately, we did succeed. We solved the problem, and so that's why we're having this conversation. But it could have easily gone out of the other way. And at some point, we would have said, you know what? Let's do the Stoic thing here. Let's accept reality for what it is. Clearly, Zeus decided that today this wasn't going to happen. Fine, let's reschedule it. Right? It is in our power to reschedule things. I'll get another piece of equipment, or we'll do some research on what was going on, and we'll solve the problem. The notion is not that you should just accept whatever happens, right? But that you should do, on the one hand, your best evaluation of what's happening, use reason, right? Try to solve the problem. Do your best to be rational and pro-social, because this is a pro-social thing that we're doing, right? We're having a conversation among human beings, trying to talk to other human beings and trying to be helpful to other human beings. So we're being Stoics right here, right now, right? But you accept from the beginning that it may not work. And if it doesn't work, you just accept it with equanimity and move on. You don't throw a tantrum. You don't get upset. You don't punch your iPad because it would be ridiculous and very expensive, among other things.
You weren't listening to me as I was fumbling with my laptop. I was not being very stoic as you guys were talking in the first part of the conversation, so I got work to do. I just want to insert that real quick.
Well, we all have work to do. But so that's that. Now you can apply the exact same thing to all sorts of scenarios, right? You go for a job interview. It comes natural to us to focus on the outcome. Will I get the job or will I not? Wrong, says Epictetus. You need to focus on what's up to you. What is up to you? To prepare your best resume, to prepare yourself for the interview, to try to get a good night's sleep before the interview, to try to get on time to the interview itself, to try to keep focus. Notice I say try, because I can try to have a good night's sleep, but if my neighbor is having a party until 1 o'clock in the morning, that's not up to me. I can try to go to get to the interview on time because that's a good way to get things started. But, I live in New York City. That could be the subways might stop working. There may be an accident. There may be traffic and so on and so forth. Those things are not up to me. And so on and so forth. Relationships. Oh, I wish she loved me, or he loved me, or they loved me. Wrong. That's the outcome. We wish to be a lovable person, to be the kind of person that somebody else might be interested in. It's up to you. That's up to you. Whether you're reciprocated or not, it's not up to you. And if it's not reciprocated, again, you don't throw a tantrum. You just say, oh, okay, I suppose it wasn't meant to be, and I'm going to move on. You will find somebody else. If you're a nice person and work on it, you'll find somebody else. So there is endless applications. So if one wants to start practicing Stoicism, I think the fundamental rule is crucial. That said, however, there's a big caveat. Sometimes people forget that the fundamental rule of Epictetus is within the broader concept of Stoicism, which means that you're supposed to be pro-social, again, virtues, etc., etc. If you take the fundamental rule by itself, well, that applies to psychopaths as well. A psychopath can apply a fundamental rule, right? I mean, Hitler might apply the fundamental rule. That doesn't make him a Stoic, right? It just makes him somebody who is shrewdly effective at what he does. And that, again, goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the difference between the philosophy and the technique, right? So you need to be careful not to use the fundamental rule just as a technique. You have to use it within the context of Stoic philosophy. You're using the fundamental rule in order to be able to live according to nature. Yeah. And that is the goal.
Great stuff, Massimo. And I want to be respectful of your time. We're getting late here. We're going to wrap it up. But no, excellent. And I tell you what, like as a practicing Stoic, I really appreciate this latest book. Again, I think it's good for those who are just, like you said, exploring the Western tradition. I think most of us who live in the West owe a lot to the Greeks and the Romans, right? A lot of the way that we live life and understand the world and we value things is based on what they thought, thousands of years ago and how we've progressed since then. But as a practicing Stoic, right, it made me reevaluate, hey, how Stoic am I, right? And I still think I'm mostly Stoic, but I think I'm going to call myself like an Aristostoicean now because I think I just coined that. I wrote that down. I'm like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. But that's here we are, right? We all have to find our own path in life. And I think we all agree, all of us in the room, that if you don't have anything else, or even if you do have something, at least the Stoic practice is there's some good pillars there. There's a good foundation to that house. And you have some posts there that you can really kind of how I see the world and how I respond to it, totally in my control. A good Stoic would say that, right? The dichotomy of control. So that I can completely control. And that gives me a lot of power. So I think I'm going to suggest now, How to Be a Stoic and your book, How to Be a Stoic, and then Bill Irvine's book of A Guide to the Good Life are books I usually point people to start out. But I think this is even before that. It's like, hey, before you say, do I really want to pursue kind of the Stoic philosophy? Do I line up more with Aristotle or Plato or even some of these other guys? And we're kind of run out of time where there really isn't a whole lot of writing. You covered some other not so known. Everybody knows who Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but when you get to the Pythagoras and some of these other people, there's so few writings. And so I wanted to ask you about the research about that. We're kind of run out of time to do that, but I think it's really good for all those listening out there. You're trying to figure out, hey, what do I believe? Does anything of the West apply to me? Maybe I want to look at Eastern traditions, things like that. It helps you find that sense of self. So really appreciate your time. So Massimo Pigliucci, he's an author, professor of philosophy, a scientist. We didn't even touch that you're a true Ph.D. scientist. We go on, but author of many books and really a fun guy. We really appreciate your time, and go out and get that book. So how do they find you, Massimo? How do they find your book, latest book?
The book is everywhere online or in bookstores where they sell books. So hopefully it's not going to be difficult. Although people need to keep in mind that if they're in Europe and the UK, the book has a different title. It's called Live Like a Philosopher. And don't ask me even why different publishers use different titles, but that's what it is. So it's beyond Stoicism in Canada and the US, and it is Live Like a Philosopher pretty much in the rest of the world. As to where to find me, I have a Substack newsletter called The Philosophy Garden. And otherwise, you can find me at massimopigliucci.org.
Awesome stuff. Appreciate your time. Great conversation. Yeah, check him out. And also lots of YouTube stuff for Massimo. Check out his TED Talk in Athens. I enjoyed that one when I was first researching him a couple of years ago. So thanks so much, Massimo. Appreciate all your time and wisdom.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.